Should the European Union expel Hungary? In recent years, the country has become the EU's most troublesome member. Under its Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, it's repeatedly undermined core union values such as respect for democracy and human rights and stands accused of rampant corruption. To add to this, it's repeatedly stood in the way of efforts to tackle Russia's invasion of Ukraine and has just become the first EU member to withdraw from the International Criminal Court. As a result, there have been growing calls for Hungary to be ejected from the Union. So, is it time for the European Union to consider throwing out its most troublesome member? Hello and welcome. If you're new to the channel, my name is James Ker-Lindsay, and here I take an informed look at international relations, conflict, security and statehood. From the United Nations to security alliances, regional groupings and economic partnerships, international organisations are central to modern international relations. But while most have a clearly defined path to membership and countries can usually choose to leave, surprisingly few have a formal mechanism to remove members. In some cases, this is for good reason. For example, the United Nations provides a forum for all countries to discuss issues of global significance. Its value lies in keeping all members talking, even if they have profound differences. But when an organisation is based on common principles, what happens when one member no longer accepts those values? A good example is the European Union. Built on shared values of democracy and open markets, while there have always been occasional differences between its members, there isn't a formal way to remove a country. This has been brought to the fore by Hungary. In recent years, it's become steadily more disruptive. Under its Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, it's taken positions that stand against the founding values of the EU. More to the point, it's become so disruptive that many seriously believe that it may even be trying to undermine the European Union from within. The European Union emerged after the Second World War. Following the chaos of two major conflicts, European leaders decided that the best way to avert future wars was to integrate the European economies. 6 European states, France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Luxembourg and Belgium, came together in 1957 to sign the Treaty of Rome, establishing a European Economic Community. Over the following decades, the community steadily expanded, taking in Britain, Denmark and Ireland in 1973, Greece in 1981, Spain and Portugal in 1986, and Austria, Sweden and Finland in 1995. Meanwhile, as well as pursuing greater economic ties, the members began to pursue deeper political integration based on respect for human rights, democracy and the rule of law. All this would come together after the end of the Cold War. As the Soviet Union collapsed, the EU became a central plank of efforts to transition the former Soviet satellite states, including Hungary, from communism to liberal democracy. The Republic of Hungary is located in Central Europe. With a population of 9.5 million, it's surrounded by 7 neighbours: Slovakia and Ukraine to its north, Romania to the east, Serbia and Croatia to its south, and Slovenia and Austria to its west. The country has a history stretching back almost 1,000 years. Having been an independent kingdom and then falling under Ottoman domination, at the end of the 17th century it came under Habsburg rule, eventually forming the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This lasted until the end of the First World War, when Hungary became an independent state, albeit losing 2/3 of its territory, a loss that many Hungarians still resent. Having sided with Nazi Germany in an attempt to reclaim back its lost lands, following the Second World War, Hungary fell under Soviet domination. This continued until the end of the Cold War, when it became a democracy. In 1994, it applied to join the European Union, becoming a member a decade later on the 1st of May 2004, alongside 9 other countries of Central and Eastern Europe and the Mediterranean. At first, Hungary was warmly welcomed into the EU, joining the Schengen area, the EU's free travel zone, just 3 years later. However, things began to change in 2010 when the centre-right Fidesz party returned to power under its leader, Viktor Orbán. Although Orbán had been seen as a modernising reformer during his previous term of office, this time things were different. Within months, he began limiting press freedom. But while he was eventually forced to roll back many of the changes, the problems escalated from there. In addition to steadily undermining human rights and civil liberties, allegations of corruption began to emerge. Meanwhile, Orbán became increasingly nationalist. As well as pushing his influence over Hungarian communities in neighbouring countries, he openly questioned the country's borders, thus straining ties with many EU partners. To add to all this, he began distancing Hungary from its EU partners in other crucial ways. For example, in 2015, he refused to take in refugees at the height of the migrant crisis, arguing that Hungary was just for Hungarians. In addition, the war in Ukraine has also seen Hungary at odds with most of its EU partners. As well as Orbán's close relations with Vladimir Putin, Hungary has frequently obstructed aid to Ukraine and threatened to block sanctions on Moscow. Most recently, Hungary has announced that it will withdraw from the International Criminal Court, a move that's been heavily condemned by many EU members. All the while, Orbán continues to stifle freedoms at home and speak out against the European Union. Having openly stated his goal of creating an illiberal democracy, he regularly condemns the EU, comparing it to the Soviet Union. I hope you're finding this useful. If so, please do consider giving it a like and perhaps subscribing if you haven't already. Thanks so much, and now back to the video. At first, the EU was reluctant to act. At the same time as many other centre-right political parties didn't want to go against one of their own, efforts to remove Hungary's voting rights required a unanimous vote from all other members. For many years, this allowed Poland, which also had a right-wing nationalist government, to block such a step. Meanwhile, Orbán would tactically reverse controversial policies at the very last minute to avert showdowns. But more recently, efforts to control Hungary have increased. For instance, the EU has introduced financial penalties for rule of law violations and taken the country to the EU Court of Justice, which has led to a €200 million fine for breaching EU asylum laws. And yet, despite all this, Hungary continues to stand against EU principles. For example, Orbán continues his crackdown on political opponents, restricts media freedoms and undermines civil liberties. Meanwhile, in addition to his obstructionist position on Russia, he continues to pursue profoundly illiberal views and decrying the European Union to the American far-right movement, regularly appearing alongside Donald Trump and attending MAGA conferences. And it's for all these reasons that many observers have now concluded that perhaps the only way to deal with Hungary is to expel it from the European Union. So, can the EU throw Hungary out? The simple answer is no, or at least not now. While it has a mechanism for members to leave voluntarily, as happened when Britain left the Union, there's no formal way to force a state out. However, as has been pointed out, that doesn't mean that it can't be done. Where there's a political will, there can be a political way. But it would be extremely difficult. But aside from this, there's actually a more important question. Would expelling Hungary be a sensible decision? On the one hand, it's tempting to see this as the logical way to deal with Orbán. In almost every possible way, Hungary has rejected the EU's core values. It's become illiberal and corrupt and has scaled back many of the principles of democracy and the rule of law. To add to all this, Orbán's friendliness towards Putin threatens European security. In this sense, and given his failure to comply with court rulings, there's never been a stronger case for expelling a member. But of course, many would argue that the EU should be open to disagreement. This is true, and it is usually. With 27 member states, there have always been differences, both political and personal. However, by and large, these countries have agreed on the overall direction of the Union and a need for unity wherever possible. They've also subscribed to the EU's central political values. But Hungary is different. Under Orbán, it's consistently undermined the fundamental principles of the Union. But balanced against all this, there are powerful arguments against expelling Hungary. For a start, it would set a dangerous precedent. Hungary may indeed deserve to be thrown out, but will this then be used against other countries, perhaps for just being difficult? Then there are enormous legal and political difficulties. Throwing Hungary out would be a huge task, and the links couldn't be severed overnight. Hundreds of thousands of Hungarians work in the EU. Likewise, many European companies operate from Hungary. Finally, it could bring other wider consequences, such as pushing Hungary even closer to Russia. This could then see it become even more disruptive within other groups, such as NATO. So, if expulsion is legally all but impossible and politically highly challenging, what could or should be done? Ultimately, rather than expel Hungary, the most workable option is to marginalise it to the point that it can't disrupt the union's day-to-day workings. But this also raises some tricky problems. The so-called nuclear option is to completely suspend Hungary's voting rights under Article 7 on Treaty of European Union. But this also carries problems. What happens if Hungary retaliates by refusing to cooperate in enforcing EU laws within its borders, thus disrupting the functioning of the Union more widely? Instead, a better option might be to pursue a more incremental approach. This could see Hungary put on special measures with further restrictions to its funding and limits to its voting rights. And just as candidates for membership are regularly monitored to ensure compliance, a system could be put in place that would condition the return of funds and voting rights on good behaviour. This would avoid the most disruptive elements of full expulsion or suspension, but still ensure that Hungary is heavily punished for its rule breaking in a way that aims to minimise disruption to the EU as a whole. Of course, if all this is unacceptable to Orbán, Hungary could always follow the UK and voluntarily leave. Indeed, as has been pointed out, if Orbán did this, the EU could well offer him excellent terms. But of course, he won't do this. Ultimately, while Orbán may like to challenge the EU, he knows that his power depends on being in the Union. Leaving would be heavily opposed by the Hungarian public, and without EU money, he would have little power of patronage back at home. All this makes his condemnation of the EU even more hypocritical, and his position all the weaker. But this whole discussion may about to become irrelevant anyway. Despite his seemingly firm grip on power, Orbán is now facing an unprecedented challenge from a former member of his Fidesz party. Polls now show that Peter Magyar has a significant lead over Orbán, and there have been large-scale anti-government protests. The question is whether Orbán will follow the lead of other autocrats and find a way to prevent him from standing in future elections. If this were to happen, the EU might then have no choice but to act. In the meantime, Orbán's behaviour has highlighted the very real challenges that just one member can pose to an organisation, and just how very difficult it can be to remove them. I hope you found that useful. If so, here are some more videos that you might like. Thanks so much for watching, and see you in the next video.